Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's make it more warmer. Good morning.
Good morning.
Don't go with the weather outside. My name is Anand Birje. I head the digital practice at HCL globally. I'm based in San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm absolutely glad and privileged to be your host this morning. I know some of you, I see return faces from last night. We had an amazing nightcap last night. It was about sports and digitalization. So we were talking about technology in sports. We had some amazing sports legends out here. And Stephanie was here with us till late last night, and she's here early morning, so I'm so excited about that. The topic for this morning is close to a lot of our hearts, right? We're talking about the human-centered approach to digital transformation. We're talking about really how enterprises that have progressed and actually evolved in their digital journeys have put human at the core of it. And Stephanie is going to help us evolve that topic with an absolutely amazing panel, and she's also going to introduce the panelists. A little bit about Stephanie and the Fast Company relationship with HCL. When we started thinking about some of these topics for our breakfast panels, the first firm that came to our mind to help us in the moderation and the creation of the content was Fast Company. Fast Company has been at the core of innovation and creativity and reporting journalism as a media company in that space for the last so many years. A lot of us, and I'm sure some of you, been following Stephanie as the editor-in-chief, evolve Fast Company as the prime place to go to on topics of disruption, innovation, and change. Stephanie has spent years, starting with her early years in Wall Street Journal as a tech reporter, and moving from there to Fortune magazine, to Vanity Fair, and more recently at Bloomberg online before coming to Fast Company as editor-in-chief. So we're very excited to have Stephanie moderate this panel for us. Stephanie, thanks for making time to fly down from New York City, and over to you.
Thank you, Anand, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Good morning, and we have a great panel to discuss the topic that Anand set up for us so beautifully. To my left, I have Scott Belsky, who is the Chief Product Officer and EVP of Creative Cloud for Adobe. Thank you, Scott, for being here. Peggy Johnson, who is the EVP of Business Development for Microsoft. Judith McKenna, who is President and CEO of Walmart International. And finally, Jake Schwartz, who is the founder of General Assembly and CEO, and it's now an Adecco company. So thank you for being here, all of you. We're going to jump right in. We have a lot of things to talk about this morning. We're going to save time for audience Q&A, so please think of things that you'd like to ask our esteemed panel. There's a great brain trust up here, and we want to take advantage of it. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists, and I think we'll just go down the row, to talk a little bit about why a human-centered approach to digital transformation is a conversation we're having today. As Anand pointed out, I mean, we've all been doing this for a long time. I've been a tech journalist for 25 years. 25 years ago, we were talking about efficiency. We were talking about tech transformation in the context of making people more productive, but not really with people at the center. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on why we're even having this conversation now. Scott?
Sure, and thank you again for hosting us and for moderating. It's exciting to be here. Well, there are a lot of thoughts on this topic, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I feel like, well, first of all, there's a saying in the startup world that the greatest companies in their very early stages are remarkably unscalable. And I've seen that time and time again, where in the early stages, it's about getting shoulder to shoulder with your customer, understanding his or her friction points, and not building a solution that you're passionate about, but rather building a solution out of empathy for the customer's suffering of the problem. And I think that a lot of companies have started to, bigger companies as well, have started to realize that and have started to empower early stage teams within their companies to build products in the same sort of way. I also always believe that technology doesn't succeed necessarily because of the technology these days, but more the user's experience of the technology. And so the question is, what sorts of new tools and frameworks and ways of working really help you develop and optimize an interface of the technology that humans can succeed with? And it's, one observation I've seen lately is just how collaborative the design process has become within a company. It's not necessarily just having the design team tackle something and then, and working with engineers to push a new version of a product. Now there's so many new stakeholders that have emerged in the design process. Everyone wants to see the next version of the product. prototyping tools have emerged to allow anyone in the company to have a say, to see, to comment, to engage. And I think that that's really fascinating as well. And then the final thing I would just say is that I also believe that the tools that we use impact the tools that we make. And so internally, I think the desire to kind of just use whatever you're given by whoever you work with internally. Internal tools are typically not beautiful and so fun to use sometimes because they're not customer facing. And I feel like that's changing. I feel like a lot of companies are actually prioritizing the internal tools, recognizing that that's the environment their employees are working within, and that impacts the decisions that they make for the customer-facing experiences. So those are just a few thoughts that I've observed at Adobe and through some other companies.
Yeah, and I want to dig into a bunch of those, including that sort of multidisciplinary aspect of work and how that's affecting the corporation. Peggy, what have you observed in the world of technology, and why are we seeing this conversation happening now?
Well, you know, we've been engaged with enterprise customers and consumers for the last 40 some odd years, so we've got to see the arc of this. And as I think we see a little bit of a tension there. So as customers and our partners for all those years see this technology that can help them possibly make their businesses better, there's a bit of a race that they feel like I've got to go out and I've got to embrace this technology. I've got to be the best I can. I've got to compete. But the tension is also, I have to be responsible. We're hearing more and more about that. A lot of this tech involves data, people's personal data. So as you're bringing that data in, you have to be careful with it. You have to make sure it's secure. You keep it private. They know what you're doing with it. So they're in the midst of this tension that can be uncomfortable at times. And then the other thing is, what am I doing to my own workers? If you're a traditional company and this fantastic tech comes in, what is that doing to my workforce? Am I ahead of that? Am I ensuring that I'm reskilling my laborers? And so there's a little bit of a tension. There's a lot of good, but there's also some concerns that we're hearing from our base.
Right. Judith, what are you seeing inside Walmart? And again, from the perspective of the human element, you have 2.2 million employees worldwide. Those folks can't be an afterthought.
No, not at all. And yeah, 2.2 million people worldwide, about 1.4 million of them working in the US and the rest over 26 countries. It's been a really interesting journey for Walmart. We've always been a people-centered company. It's always the associates are at the heart of what we do. So we were kind of trying to come at this a different way. How do you take a people company and help transform it into more of a tech company? And we were in this interesting journey, which is we started to talk about, are we a tech company? And then we stopped ourselves short and said, actually, we're a people-powered company empowered by tech. And that's actually a really important distinction. You know, words matter, and for us and for our folks, it matters hugely. So trying to turn that into reality has been really important. There's clearly the customer angle, customer-centric, thinking about how we can make lives easier for people by the tech that we use, the problems that we're solving for customers to get things to them faster, how they want it. But one of the really interesting areas with that many people, and I would agree with both of you, is the impact for associates that technology can have. And when you've got that many people, you've got to take people with you. Because if you don't, you're not going to succeed. So everything that we've done has not only been talking about what does being digital mean, what does tech mean, but let us show you and let us help you to make your lives easier to do the jobs that you do every day. And one great example of that is that if we now in stores, everybody does something on a device that has a screen that actually looks like a smartphone screen. Because if I told you what they were using 4 years ago was something, it was called a Telson gun. The last time it was introduced, I think in 1980, and it still had a green screen. And the only people that had ever seen a green screen is anybody over 40. I mean, that was kind of the way this worked. And in store, they were like, this does not work. But we can show you, not just tell you this is important, but we can show you, look, here's something new. This is how you use it. Don't be scared of it. So incredibly important that you take your workforce with you. And this humanity side of it and how you care and how they feel just reflects back into the customer service that you give.
Jake, before you answer the question, maybe just tell the audience a little bit about what General Assembly's mission is, and obviously that might inform your answer about why companies are taking this human-centered approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So General Assembly Our mission is to empower the world to pursue the work they love. And we do that through creating bridges between education and employment with the real practical skills around data, technology, and design that really are driving digital transformation. And so we started with serving individuals and actually expanded to around 23 campuses in cities around the world. We've graduated over 70,000 people through 3-month vocational programs in those types of skills. And over the last few years, what we've found is a real demand with large Fortune 500 companies going through digital transformations to enact really large reskilling and upskilling programs that help bring the humans that really make up these organizations along this journey. And so I think we've gotten to see firsthand what that human impact can be. And I think it's very interesting because I love that you use digital transformation in this title, because we find almost every client has a digital transformation plan in motion right now, and it's typically the most important initiative in the company. And but that can almost be a buzzword as well. And so I think it's really important to break it down. It's almost represented by the people on this panel. So you have that infrastructure layer, which you could sort of shorthand say cloud, but it's much more than that. And when you change that infrastructure layer, what the humans do, first off, it's not completely automated at all, and there's still a need for humans who actually have a much higher leverage role in making sure that the organization functions. But on top of that infrastructure layer, you then can store, transmit, and manipulate data in ways that you really couldn't, especially firm-wide. And that's an incredibly important layer that you can't really just leave with a tiny little data team in a corner somewhere. And then with those two layers, then you get to the fun part, which is reinventing how you create, maintain products, and communicate with your customer in ways that can drive like meaningful competitive advantage. And what we see is at each one of those levels, to make that work, yes, you need the technology and the enablement, but without the people, and really not just top people, but everyone in the organization understanding how fundamentally this empowers them to do more, faster, better, and closer to the customer is such an important piece of that. And so there's a change management component of making sure everyone's on board with what the strategy is, but there's also making sure that people inside your organization have the opportunities to upskill into new roles and to be sometimes radically reskilled so that they can stay with the organization when their previous function is now going to be obsolete. And so we do this at massive scale with companies around the world, and it's really fun to have that level of impact and to see the power, because everybody wins when you really succeed in that reskilling and upskilling effort.
Peggy, you spoke a little bit in your opening comments about the tension that exists inside some of your customers. I want to ask you a little bit about Microsoft's own transformation. Under Satya Nadella, the company has undergone a pretty big transformation culturally as well as in terms of the portfolio and the business model. Talk a little bit in response to what Jake was saying about how you've communicated to the employee base these changes, because even inside a tech-savvy company like Microsoft, people's jobs are going to change as the company evolves.
Absolutely. And for us, it really went back to this idea of culture. And, there's the saying, culture eats strategy for lunch, and it absolutely does. It's a true statement. But for us, our whole entire transformation, we can take it back to the cultural transformation. We ourselves are on a digital transformation, but we've gone through this cultural transformation. And it all started with actually a book that Satya had read called Mindset. And it was about going from being the know-it-all in the room to being the learn-it-all in the room. And that has been at the center of our transformation. If you step back and say, you can keep taking a product and adding things to it and making it better and better, but if you're not pleasing the customer, if you're not listening to the customer, that's all for naught. And we really pivoted around that as a company, and that is what set us off on that cultural transformation. And how did we reach 130,000 plus employees? We just went back to it over and over and over again. There was a consistency about that message. It all laddered up to our mission statement, which was to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And if you have a purpose and everybody knows what that purpose is. Satya likes to say, you're in the boat together. The Boys in the Boat that was set in Seattle, we all read that book, and it's about the swing of the boat, and you're all in it together, and you're all pointed at the same thing. And that consistency of message, I can't understate that. That is not something that I think we thought about in the beginning, but it is what helped us engage all of those 130,000 employees. We just kept going back to it.
Consistency, but also authenticity of message, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the employees have to believe that you have your heart in it.
Yeah, you have to have that as your center, and it's your North Star, and it's what made all the difference for us.
Judith, you did something a little bit different at Walmart. Rather than trying to communicate to your employees, you undertook listening tours when you first became COO of Walmart US. And again, with 1.4 million employees, that's a lot of people to listen to. But tell me a little bit about those tours and what came out of that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of dilemma in the world, which is for all the technology in the world, you sometimes can't beat face-to-face, which is probably why you're all here and not looking at this on a video. It actually matters, even though it's early in the morning. I think when I went into the US, I'd come from a background in the UK and used to running a much smaller business. The US has about 4,500 stores, which means 4,500 store managers. And the answer usually lies in your people somewhere. So, I agree with you 100%. It's your mission, it's your alignment. And they'll tell you which bits of what you're talking about they don't understand and help you course correct as you do it. So I set out on a rather ambitious objective over a couple of years to talk to every single store manager. And we brought them together. I went around the country, bringing people together in groups of 50, 60 people, and just listened to what they had to tell us. And when we started the journey, they talked about two things. They talked about technology, and I've talked to you a little bit about the kind of Telsons and that journey, but they were kind of help us do our jobs better because we need to retain our people better. And in order to do that, we need to train our people so they feel confident about what they're doing and what the future looks like as well. So we've got this deep, we call it grassroots kind of listening idea that complements into the kind of transformation that we're trying to go through, because the dark side of this is people are scared of it. And if you're working on the front line and you're serving the customers on the front line, the question is, when you put in a self-checkout, how does it affect me? And is that digital, or is that just, you're moving my job on? And that education process has been really important to us as we've gone through it. So this concept of we've got the purpose, we save people money so that they can live better, but that people actually can relate to what's happening to them in a way. But the fundamental of all of these transformation programs, and you mentioned change management and process is the hardest part of it, not the tech part of it, is keep listening to people. And that's what we set out to do so that you build trust. And if you build trust, people say, okay, I think you've got my back here. I'm going to go with this until the next milestone. And that's the ethos around it that we've tried to create.
And Judith, you had those listening tours also helped result in a specific training program. Can you talk a little bit about Walmart Academy?
I can indeed. So when the teams were talking to us about how can we train people, there was very little training existed in the US for the stores at that time for our associates, no matter what level they were at. So we took a very bold move to introduce something we called academies. So we introduced basically 200 education institutes right across the US, completely based on educating our associates. Just to give you an idea of scale on that, last year we trained 500,000 people through that, which is outside, I think, the US military. We're the largest training organization in the US, which is quite scary.
I feel tiny now.
No. But we're learning from businesses like yours about the best way to do that. But we set these up. People go through that. It's their progression through management. They learn the skills to do their job. They learn leadership skills. And they're learning digital. And when we set out on the journey, we said, hang on a minute. It's okay if we talk about this digital thing, but if we don't teach in a digital way, then how do we expect people to think we're actually on a journey? So we did a couple of things, which sounds very simple, but it's really important. We had iPads for everybody. There was no paper learning. Everything was iPad and app applied. Now, you might think, well, everybody knows how to use an iPad, or everybody uses an app. That's not true. So you have to teach people to do it. But then the other thing we did is we introduced VR training. So we actually teach using VR, virtual reality, in the classrooms so people can experience it. Oh, and by the way, there's a huge business case behind that because people retain, statistically proven that people retain better from VR learning than they do from standard learning, and they have fun. So these education academies now are, think of it like a systemic learning program where people can keep coming back to it and learning. So Walmart set itself up to be able to constantly refresh and teach. It's not a once and done. You have to keep going with people because otherwise, oh, that was really nice, and then we've all done it. Next week, okay, life's got in the way and I've forgotten what you taught me. So that's the academies are an integral part of the transformation process that we're on.
Jake, you talked a little bit about not only reskilling people, but not retraining people, but reskilling people. Have you seen examples of companies that you've worked with where people have gone from doing job A to moving into job B to support the company's digital transformation goals?
Absolutely, all the time. I would say, first off, when we were just a consumer-facing company, we would see dramatic stories all the time. A Starbucks barista becomes a data scientist, and so on.
Is that a real story?
It's a real story, but
It's a great soundbite.
I actually hate bringing them up because I think it overplays this sort of drama of it and underplays sort of the importance of this for people who don't quite have that dramatic of a story. Because for every one of those, there's some philosophy major from NYU who was gonna go to law school, and we saved them from that terrible path. And as minor as that sounds,
the lawyers in the room aren't offended.
Are there lawyers? Lawyers don't go to Davos, do they? They're too busy billing hours. So I think my mic keeps coming in and okay, interesting. I would say. And then on inside, there's two ways that we see reskilling really work. One is we've done a big project with a sort of legacy insurance company, which is where they actually took existing IT workers, really on-prem IT workers, and instead of just laying them off, they knew they had, they were going to lay off over here and then have a massive hole in their organization over here that they were going to need to hire and spend a bunch of money to fill those seats over here. Is they actually sent them to a custom cohort at GA for them with very specific stack of skills that they required. And they for 3 months, they went every day to General Assembly, learned a whole new skill, just like one of our consumer programs. And at the end, they had a job waiting for them in this new department. And why does that make sense? And I think this is a really important element of this, is that for every one of these things, it can't just be a feel-good or a one-time thing. It's got to be clear that it's tied to the financial performance of the company, and you have to see a return on investment. And so the return on investment in that case is a layoff costs money, real money. And then you have the chaos that ensues afterwards. That costs money. And then for skilled workers, the cost of acquisition of those workers is higher than it's ever been. And there's a simple reason for that, is that there is a secular shortage. There's not enough people in the world who can take all the data jobs and software jobs that are out there right now. And so it is going to be either an I drink your milkshake problem, where you're going to be poaching and bidding up these skilled workers, or you find a way to build as an alternative to buy and create a sustainable source of that talent. Another way we can do that is bring people from the outside who maybe had a very different level of experience but want to enter technology. And we've partnered and built really cool programs where we bring people in, train them on the way in. They commit to then working at a company for a couple of years to get their feet wet. And it's almost like a disruption of the recruiting model, where we become the sort of source, but we can vet along the way and deliver people training and a job and at no cost to them. And so actually a great example of this is Adobe. And Scott, I don't know if you know this, but we built a program for Adobe called the Adobe Digital Academy that is focused on bringing people of color and women, really underrepresented groups in technology, into their engineering org. And we have built, it's a fellowship program. If they get in, they pay nothing. They train for 3 months with General Assembly and then go work on a team in Adobe. And this program has now had, I believe, over 100 people go through it. And almost all of them now work at Adobe, which you can imagine significantly increases the diversity ratios on those engineering teams. And so once you're building instead of buying, you're no longer a victim of what the existing talent pipeline looks like. You can craft it in a way that serves your business's interests and the organization's goals.
So not to belabor the barista turned data scientist analogy too much, but Scott, why is that a good thing? Why is it important to get people who have the philosophy background, the sort of customer service background, and turn them and help them find their way into tech jobs? You have a take on creatives moving into rising up in the business world.
Sure. Well, I think, whatever area is your sort of competitive advantage, and for a lot of companies, they would say design is now a competitive advantage of theirs. You have to not only hire and train skilled workers in that area, you also have to innovate in that area. And I've always believed that innovation sort of happens at the edge. It's people that see things a little differently, that have a different background, that have a different sort of basis of experience that they're applying to a problem to solve it in a new way. And in order to stack the deck in your favor in doing this, you have to, of course, hire people that are different. Remarkably different, remarkable people, right? So I love this idea of taking folks that are from sort of one skill set and actually bringing them in, and so they'll adopt a new skill set, but they'll again see it in a new way. I think that I always think of diversity programs also as an advantage to stacking the deck in your favor when it comes to innovation within a given field, and it's exciting. I mean, we're also doing a big sort of AI retraining effort within the company as well, where any engineer, whether he or she has been at the company for 10, 15 plus years, can say to their manager, I want to enroll in this AI training program. And it's a year-long effort where they're literally, to some extent, being reskilled in a technology that we think their segment products will ultimately need. I mean, you look at a product like Photoshop, we're trying to think about ways to reduce the mundane, repetitive labor that a creative professional needs to do every day in a product like Photoshop. And we're not, people always say, oh, well, creativity and AI, are you going to try to automate creativity? I actually think that creativity is the most uniquely human trait there is. However, go to any creative and ask them, how much time are they spending every day doing mundane, repetitive stuff? And they'll tell you, oh my goodness, like 50% of my day. But how do you transform a product like that? You have to have newly skilled engineers or engineers that look at things in a different way. And that goes back to pipeline and in training and internal change management and transformation of the way people see the problem they're solving, and customer centricity. How do you make sure at the end of the day, the folks that are leading a product, whether they're engineers or designers or product leaders, are engaging with customers on a regular basis? And actually that's harder to do than to say. Right. You need to find hacks and ways of doing it on an everyday basis. And actually, that's one of the things that I think social media can be helpful with in terms of product managers. Actually, on a daily basis, getting in the weeds with a customer or two is always a helpful thing.
Can I just one thread from that I think you've said is so true, which is many of the people with the skill sets we need for the future are very different people. So how do you create working environments where they feel comfortable, and actually the people who are around them feel comfortable and don't reject them? Because it's a bit like the kind of white blood cells in the body. Somebody comes in and they're different, and you pop the virus out because you really don't want it infecting the rest of the organization. And how do you get through that? And I think that is, for more traditional organizations like my own, that's one of the big challenges that we've got. So having people with resilience when they come in to do that and creating this openness to change is so important.
And if I could just add one more thing that you'd said, Scott, about the mundane. You have these creative people, yet every day their job is full of mundane work that they have to do because it's part of their job. This is an area that we're focused on at Microsoft, trying to take those mundane tasks and foist that off onto some new technologies to free your creatives up, to have more cycles, to think creatively. Because when you think about it, time is one of our scarcest commodities, and if they're just, sifting through emails, can we shoot them to the right email more quickly so they can be creative? And I think that's something that if you can bridge that to your employees, they're more accepting of technology, if it gives them cycles back in their day.
And in this way, AI makes us more human in some ways by freeing up our capacity to do the things that are uniquely human, that only we can do to some extent. And the stuff that can be just done through algorithms is more often done that way, right?
Scott, you had talked a little bit about this idea that, product managers need to get closer to the customer. And I wonder if you have any, for all the panelists, but I'll start with Scott, what are the best practices for trying to bring what is sometimes called design thinking or a more human-centered approach throughout the organization as it pertains to either the customer or the employee or others in the ecosystem? Because, again, we're talking about some very large organizations on this stage. How do you populate a human-centered mentality throughout an organization?
Yeah, it's well, two quick thoughts on that, because I think about this all the time. The first is this notion of, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. You can have people sitting around the table from different disciplines trying to solve a problem, and everyone sort of talks about it and pontificates and cites research and tests and everything else. But something magical happens when you just put a prototype in front of everyone, and everyone walks through the customer journey. Literally, like, what is the default when someone opens the product for the first time? What is the error message when they click that instead of this? If everyone has to walk through it, they start to feel the pain of the customer and develop an intuition for the right solution as opposed to just discussing it. And now that, again, requires a design-centric approach to product development. It requires that prototypes are developed in the earlier stages of a product as opposed to a bit later on. It requires that designers are empowered to kind of fill in the blanks of what the product should do before it's been defined by the product manager. And that actually requires a culture change, because a lot of, especially older technology companies, that's antithetical to the way products are developed. And so that's one thing. The second thing I would say is I've noticed around the organization, the product managers that I respect the most are engaging customers directly on platforms like Twitter. And it almost looks like they're, like, what a waste of time. My goodness, like, you're a busy product manager and you're going on Twitter every day and you're searching for mentions of your product and you're engaging customers on a one-off basis. That can't be, again, like that remarkably unscalable comment earlier. Why are they doing that? Well, if you think about it, first of all, they're actually engaging with a customer every day, which, again, is something that product managers, I believe, great product leaders should do. The other thing that they're doing is when they're engaging with a customer on a one-by-one basis, it's actually not one-to-one, it's one-to-many. And so when I'm responding to a customer complaining about one of our products, a lot of other people are watching, and what are they seeing? They're seeing us become less corporate and more human-centered in how we're relating to a customer's friction that they're encountering and how to resolve it. And when we start to share our roadmap and empathize, that's something that everyone else is tuning into. And these days, our brand is no longer ours as a company. Our brand belongs to whatever the community is saying about us at every given moment. And so I think it's good for brand, I think it's good for product insights and for customer empathy on a sustained basis for leaders to engage with customers in an open forum like that.
And it probably helps when their leaders say, this is a good thing to do.
I think so.
Yeah. Peggy, what are your thoughts on how you try to, in an organization that's 130,000 plus strong, get everybody on the same page about being human-centric, whether it's in terms of managing their employees or engaging with the customer or other ecosystems they deal with?
Well, we try to draw everything back to, well, you said the word empathy, and to understand what your customer needs, put yourself in the customer's shoes. And I think in the past, we built products and we said, okay, our products are used now by hundreds of millions of people, so we want to make sure we're building a product that most people will want to use. And we've tried to reframe that, again, being centered on empathy and saying, who are we excluding when we do that? And so as we build this product, can we build it just maybe a little bit better and include more people in the use of that product? And a couple examples of that are our Xbox adaptive controller. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's pretty cool. Where we build Xbox. We have consoles, and a lot of people use those consoles to game with. Well, there was a whole group of people who were disabled, who had some type of disability that they weren't able to use that controller, and they weren't able to experience that. And some of them had been disabled, but others had become disabled. And they used to be gamers, and they missed playing and being involved in there. And with gaming, you've got to be quick, and you've got to be able to press the buttons, and that allows you to win. I'm terrible at it, but anybody who's good at it knows that quick twitch speed is important. And so we had a team who said, well, what could we do to include those who don't have the ability to use this box? And they came up with the Xbox adaptive controller, and it's amazing. From the box itself, when you take it out of the box, it's easy to take out of the box. You don't have to, get a knife out and cut anything open. It almost falls open. And it comes out, and you have the ability to play with a broader set of capabilities and inputs. And it's made all the difference in the world for an entire group of people. And by the way, I think when we think about being inclusive, we might think, well, yeah, there's some people who need that. We all need something at some point in time. There's a time when each of us have some sort of a disability, and maybe we don't have a broken arm, but maybe we are holding a child in one hand, which a lot of people are doing. A lot of young dads have told us that Xbox adaptive controller has been great. And so you have this ability to please all sorts of people beyond that initial group that you were targeted. So if you can open up your thinking and saying, who am I excluding, you more often than not are going to bring in a broader set of folks than you were initially designing for.
We've talked about some great examples of reskilling and retraining folks, avoiding layoffs as a result of moving people into new positions. But I do want to talk about the hard business realities that a lot of companies are facing. We're in the middle of a good economic cycle, but recessions are inevitable. I'd love to hear a little bit from each of the panelists about how how we balance that human-centric approach with the very real business considerations that a lot of companies are dealing with. I'll start with you, Jake.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mentioned earlier that if it doesn't translate into the financial language that the CFO, who really makes so many of the decisions in corporate culture, if they can't see the value, it's going to be the first thing that goes in tough times. And there's a couple things about that. One is, there's an interesting observation that we use the terms human capital and investing in your people, and yet nowhere on a balance sheet do those items exist. In fact, humans in a company are typically only a cost item and a line item in that way. And so one of the things, Adecco's CEO, who's I think really on the forefront of talking about trying to reinvent the social contract, is part of the International Labor Organization, and they're putting forth some really interesting ideas about how to enable companies to amortize investments in human capital, how to make sure that investing in their people gets good tax treatment and accounting treatment in a way that at least creates parity between that and physical capital and software, so that the trade-offs are not so heavily weighted towards the non-human elements of investment. That's level one. I think level two, and this is very specific to these digital transformations, is when we have a downturn, because it will happen at some point, that will be a cycle, and those are very natural and are going to continue to happen. But I think you can't underestimate the power of the secular trend that is this imperative of every company to turn their company into a at least software and technology enabled company, if not actually a software company. And so my view is that the next downturn is going to accelerate these transitions in many ways, as at least smart CEOs are going to use it as an opportunity to restructure their organization to really push these digital transformations to the forefront. But very clearly in those settings, when you're faced with having to lay off 1,000 people, those are the times, or 2,000 people, those are the times when reskilling becomes such a useful tool to at least counter the narrative that they're just doing whatever the bottom line is dictating to them. And so we've seen some of that already over the last couple of years. And And I think there's a huge opportunity in those moments. I will say Adecco, people don't really know this, but Adecco owns the largest outplacement services company in the world that really helps with career transitions services for really most of the companies in the world when they do layoffs. And one of the reasons they were so excited to acquire GA was that as opposed to just career transition where you career counsel, make people feel better, get them on the right path, we now have tools to actually get them ready to be redeployed and oftentimes help them be redeployed in the same company. So there are lots of moments like that that need to happen. And I think the really key point that I'll keep coming back to is this doesn't work if it's just a trendy thing or something that like we say on stage. And so we spend a lot of time understanding how the CFO looks at these problems. Why is there an ROI to reskilling? And I think the answer often lies in all of the direct and indirect costs around the employment life cycle that frankly for too long a lot of HR organizations have sort of softened the edges of, and it's sort of a lot of kind of cloudy thinking about what happens. And when you turn it to a data-driven approach of what's our churn, what's the real cost of acquiring an employee, what's the cost when they leave, what's the cost when we can't fill that seat for an extra 3 months and the CTO is yelling at me, which is actually a really important one. They often are not connected close enough to the business to really understand those things, and puts them in the seat of then just having to execute on some very roughshod layoff and restructuring plan. And I think to the extent that you integrate HR into the business goals, you find all of these ways to make do with more. You can do a lot more with less. And I think that's really the point here. It's not about unlocking some new magical pot of money that you're going to use to reskill. There's no extra money in the world, right? This is about resources that companies are already spending in massive amounts to things that generate a higher return for the company.
Judith, what is the conversation like inside Walmart? You obviously are going through a major transition as a retailer. Digital is becoming increasingly important as you look at your international markets. You have concepts like, Alibaba's HEMA stores that you're competing with. When you look at the hard business realities you're facing and you compare those to the human-centric approach to your employees, tell us a little bit about the sort of tension that exists there.
Yeah, so actually as an ex-CFO, I was a CFO for 10 years. I wish I'd had that much power. But I think everybody is beginning to recognize that people at the heart of this, and if you don't go on that journey with people, and the return that you get from your workforce is really significant. And therefore, I do think businesses are starting to make different decisions. We've certainly have and need to continue to do more of that as well. It's really hard, and it's been interesting being here this week and the number of different conversations about the future of work and how jobs are going to be impacted. And I've heard every number from 10% to 100%. And I think a couple of weeks ago, Ginny Rometty said 10% of jobs will, go, but 90% will change. And I think that disruptive element of what we all do every day, what you do every day, what we do every day is different to what we did even a few years ago because technology has enabled so much more. So the inner tension for us is how do you balance the efficiency and the effectiveness of the organization with the introduction of automation, AI, and how do you balance that with the need to give customer service as well, and a business model that's radically changing. So I'm an optimist, I'm a glass half full. And what I see is as roles are changing, I'll use the stores again as the example, but it applies to our home offices as well, new roles are emerging. So whilst there are jobs today that we never even thought were possible 5 years ago, some of them are very practical. So online grocery shopping and delivery to your home. That didn't exist in the US as a concept. It's existed in Europe and the UK for a long time. But that didn't exist as a concept. So actually we've created new jobs to do that. Even though some of the, say, cashier jobs are not there anymore, we've reskilled, retrained, and put people on programs to be able to pick the products and to deliver it and to do that. So that's a big area for it. But even in the home office, we're seeing this shift. So this need for different skill sets. So we've got an internal reskill program that we're looking at to say, okay, we know the workforce of the future will probably be lower than it is today, but what we definitely know it's in the wrong place. So how do we move it from there to there? And we've done a study that says, what jobs will we have in the future? And therefore, so use the data to help you. And therefore, what skills will you need to be able to fulfill those jobs? And we're on a journey at the moment to say, how do we best shift people around the organization? And, how much of it is training? How much of it is attitude and aptitude? And how can we make sure that we take people with us on that journey? And irrespective of whether they stay with Walmart or not, did we give them and equip them with a set of skills for the outside world as well? And I think businesses have got to stop being kind of so thinking of this as a competitive advantage in what they do. I think it's much more important going forwards that as industries and as collectives, we think about how do we retrain, reskill for the future? Because the job may not be with my organization, but it may be with your organization. And I think a much more holistic approach to this is something that, as communities, we need to be thinking through.
And I think you're seeing a few other, you're seeing companies starting to think about remote working and other forms of the workforce that, may have not at one point seemed even feasible or interesting and are suddenly more. And I think products like Microsoft Teams and others are enabling people to just work in new ways. A lot of teams that even work together are now interacting more digitally because it's just a more native experience for them. So when the resources go away, the resourcefulness kicks in. And I think that's like a muscle memory that you build that just lasts a long time. But it's interesting, we're talking a lot about the reskilling of workers. But when you kind of go down the stack towards K through 12 education, and you start to ask, are we also outfitting this population of people to succeed in our companies in the modern workforce, where whether it's 90% or 100% of all jobs will be impacted? The way we think about it is really about creativity and how in any of our organizations across any job function, if you're able to stand out at work, if you're able to stand out on social, if you're able to visually express your ideas in very compelling and unique ways, that is probably one of the most unique success factors of the future of employment. And yet we are still using the traditional education curriculum in schools, and we're not really outfitting students to use these tools to and become native with them, so that later on they they do whip out a product like Photoshop or whatever it is, and take a unique stab at showing rather than telling a story. And so I do think that has to kind of come back into the traditional education part as well.
100% with you on education. I was talking to somebody the other day who was talking about their 12-year-old, and what they were saying is teaching geography is the example in a very traditional way of geography. This is somebody who was brought up with Google Maps. That concept for them is, why are you teaching me in a traditional way when actually I don't need that the way you're thinking about it. I need to think about it in a completely different way, and unleashing the creativity through that. I think you're exactly right.
I want to just point out one thing, and the way we're talking about it is very good, but having been in a lot of education and education technology conversations, one potential danger is that what you guys are not saying is we need to start turning K through 12 into vocational training. Because here's the simple reality. By the time they graduate and are ready to join the workforce, we don't know precisely what the tools and jobs will be. But we do know, I think there's two things, and they're really the only two things that matter. One is what Scott said, which is this creativity, structure, metacognitive, structural thinking. There's a whole family of stuff there that's so valuable and is going to be resilient to whatever changes happen in the world. The other is numeracy and facility with data, right? Which we know is going to drive decision-making for the future, regardless of what tools and what technologies exist. And, it's a little crazy that, the path of mathematics in elementary through high school, ends in calculus. And, when I went to school, it took me until I was studying for the CFA when I was trying to be an investor that I learned statistics, right? Which was the most mind-blowing thing in the world. And if you think about, data science is essentially statistics with fancy tools, right? And so, it's really much more basic than, we don't need to teach everybody how to, do every part of building a technology stack or teach them how to build applications per se. We need to make sure that we're equipping people with these core skills that we know, regardless of what happens in the future, they will have the tools to then learn in the moment what needs to be learned.
Peggy?
Yeah, just going back to the reskilling part, one of the things that we like to do is keep humans at the center and using technology to augment the human experience rather than to replace the human experience. And one area that we've seen it with customer service agents is giving them tools in the background as they have a live customer on the phone. They're trying to help them, and instead of sifting through FAQs and trying to find the exact right answer, we can use AI technology to have listened to a number of conversations, and hearing what the customer is complaining about knows what the answer is to that specific question. And going to what you said, then you feel better about your job. That customer service agent who is then fed up the right answer, this is probably what the customer wants, feels better about their job. They've pleased the customer, they've moved them along more quickly. They just feel like they got them the answer in quite a bit less time than in the old way. So if you put technology at the center and think about it augmenting humans rather than replacing it, I think you're going to get a higher ROI at the end of the day.
We're going to go to audience Q&A in a few minutes, and please think about questions you'd like to ask this panel, because as I said, it's an incredible brain trust. But I want to go back to something that, Scott, you said at the very beginning, which is this idea that, more and more work is going to be multidisciplinary. You're going to put designers next to engineers. You're going to put human resources people, as Jake mentioned, in the same conversation as the CFO or the CTO. Starting with you, Scott, and then maybe other panelists can chime in. What are the best practices for breaking down those silos? Because in a lot of organizations, that kind of multidisciplinary approach, while incredibly necessary, is hard to do. It comes back to culture, but I would love your thoughts on what's worked at Adobe and maybe even at some of your clients that really has enabled these conversations across functions to happen in a really productive, meaningful way.
Yeah, I think there's a few thoughts. First of all, it's all about empowering different people at different times. Traditionally in technology, they're engineering-driven organizations, and as a result, whether it's design or product management or other functions, are sort of just not as important, frankly, and are often not in the room. Mm-hmm. And a lot can be, you send a big message to an organization based on who is in the room for what decisions, and whether as a leader you're willing to say, we're not going to meet now because so-and-so is not in the room. And for me, that was always about the designers. Is the designer who did this work in the room? And if she's not here, let's just not meet. So I think you have to send strong messages, and that is a culture change, right? When you decide you're going to fix some of the lopsidedness of certain teams in certain areas and that sort of thing. I also think that I mentioned collaboration earlier and this notion of everyone wanting to be a stakeholder in the outcome, but you have to retool the way you make things in order to actually have that be feasible. We're thinking a lot about this in the field of experience in UI design and how everyone's making a digital product of some kind these days. Whether you are a B2B or a B2C business, the consumerization of technology is a trend. It's important. Back to the point of an iPhone being easier to use in this green screen tool that no one knows how to use. How do we make sure that every product interface is something that people can resonate with and whatever else? And in order to do that, you have to have tools that engage different types of stakeholders that are accessible to everyone, and not just privy to the engineering and design teams, for instance. So we're thinking about it, when I think about it from a standpoint of my role at Adobe, I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of how we're running meetings, who's empowered at different stages of the process, and the message that sends to the organization, and also just the workflow itself, and how to have it be more transparent to different job functions, and have it be more inclusive.
Peggy, you have a lot of collaborative tools in your toolkit. Do they work internally? Are they helping to break down those silos?
They do, and Scott mentioned Teams, which is a collaborative product that we have that helps everybody to weigh in, see what others are doing. and it has a long history of whether it's video or chatting or a document. You can go back, so someone new to the team can see the history. So it's been fascinating for us to watch our own workforce embrace that. But going back to one of the best practices that we've found about sort of breaking down some of the silos, every year we have a hackathon on our campus, and something like 20% of our workforce partakes in this 1 week where we pause and we allow whoever from whatever discipline to go off and work together to solve problems. And we have not just engineers, but lawyers and finance people and marketing people and customer service people come together, and they just look at problems differently, you know? And what has come out of it has been a plethora of ideas that we've then incorporated into our products that we send out into the world. It's been amazing when you allow people to come together. You don't exclude anybody from the room, and you say, you know, let's try and solve this problem. One of the things that came out of it a couple years ago was something called Scene AI, where they used one of our engineering tools, our cognitive tools of computer vision, just to look at a display or, you know, look at the world around you and translate that. And it turned out to be an amazing tool for people who are visually impaired, just to go shopping at the store and take their phone and hold it up in an aisle, and it'll tell them what they're looking at. And it came out of our hackathon. So just a number of things that if you put different people together with different perspectives and this diversity of thought, you will come up with some amazing technology and innovation.
I think just to touch on one thing with it, we talked about prototypes of product. You can prototype ways of working as well. And one of our Mexico team decided we're going to become digital and moved to a product mindset. And they set up some product teams, and they had they were trying to solve a particular problem, which was how to recruit faster and get people into the organization. That was kind of their problem statement. And they learned, you know, the whole thing, we're not falling in love with the solution, we're falling in love with the problem, and they had all the banter. The first one they did, they brought a real cross-disciplinary team together, and it was a disaster, because nobody knew how to work in that environment collaboratively. But there was enough that came out of it that intrigued people to set up 3 more teams to do 3 more different problems. And from those 3 teams, they've now created something which they call Zone 18, which is 18 different teams across the organization, all solving problems, working in a collaborative way, bringing people in. But the first, you know, it took somebody to give it a go. It was a prototype of a very different sort, and people learned from it and moved on. So one of the things we've learned is that you can't just say, that's it, we're now a design-based organization, we work in a completely different way. You've got to help walk to that as well. And humanity, take people with you when you do it.
Questions from the audience? We have a mic runner in the back, so right here. Could you tell us who you are and where you're from?
Sure, Tom Moriarty from CBS Health, and confession first, I am a lawyer at Davos. So, but I guess there are 2 very large forces that are colliding right now, and probably will collide even more as we go forward. And that is the power of data, the human-centered approach, data analytics, and particularly in healthcare, with what are legitimate concerns around privacy. And so it's not fully solvable here, but I'm curious about your thoughts about how we navigate those tensions using a human-centered approach.
So I can jump in. One of the things that we've been working on at Microsoft are tools that can look across databases that have personal healthcare data in it, but it stays anonymized. And so you're not pulling it in and then it's in your care and trust, but if you can leave it in the database and reason across that data pool without having to move it in and get it perhaps, you know, hackable, you want to keep it in a safe and secure place and actually reason over it while it's out there. That's one way that you can look at healthcare data from a number of people and glean insights from it.
Yeah, I would say this actually, interestingly, goes back to this cross-disciplinary teams and collaboration idea of who's in the room. So now, regulatory HIPAA stuff aside, which is always a thing, I would say one of the big questions is how is security treated by the product and UX people who are building these products? right? Are they the annoying compliance person who shows up and tells them what they can't do? Or is security treated as a feature, part of this product that is important to serving the customer in the way they want to, and part of that design team? I think I've seen great examples where security, when treated that as such, as a crucial member of making a product work, and it is part of that user experience process, becomes not as much a blocker, but instead a real, contributor to the entire system.
I would say also I'm recalled, Jake, as you're speaking, I'm remembering a number of websites, maybe 7 to 10 years ago, when no one would ever understand the terms of service and the privacy policy, and it was just like jargon, legal jargon. There were a few companies that came out innovating in the navigation of these terms, where I remember one website, and then everyone started doing it. They had a left-hand side and a right-hand side. The right-hand side was the actual legal jargon from the legal department. The left-hand side was an annotated, well-designed, beautiful typography with symbols of like helping navigate what this actually means in layman's terms. And it was such an interesting innovation. To your point, you could tell you had some product designers in the room as opposed to just the legal department. And so I wonder why that hasn't come to the world of data and privacy yet. If you're a patient, and if you say to me, Scott, do you want your data shared? Of course I'm going to say no. Who says yes? But if you kind of help me visually understand, what is being shared, what's being anonymized, how is this ultimately helping me as a long-term patient, then I might, opt in. And the design has not yet been used, though, I find, to innovate in that space.
I think this is clearly a huge topic of conversation for everybody at the moment, and it should be on every leadership's team's minds about how we use data and privacy around data and protecting customers in a trust-centric world. And, it's not a tech issue, it's not any part of the business, it's a leadership issue for everybody. It's certainly on our minds about how we do that, and I agree with this. There is... if you take it from a customer perspective, I think there are two things that customers would want. The first is be transparent about how you're using my data and perhaps give me some level of control over whether I opt in on an anonymous basis or I want to be used personally in something. And the second is don't surprise me. Mm-hmm. Don't surprise me with the way this is being used or what you are doing with this. And I think continuing to have a customer-centric approach to privacy, and there's one extreme which is GDPR, and the challenges that gives from an implementation perspective. And then there is, I think, other countries around the world who have a very different view, and customers and associates who have a very different view of their personal data. But I think this is a huge topic, and it's one of those ones I've been surprised at the lack of conversation here about it. I think this will become more of a conversation for anybody who's here next year. I'm sure this will be very much on the agenda.
There's a question up here. If you could just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. My name is Alphonse. I'm a lawyer by education.
Oh my God. I have to do a massive mea culpa here now.
But I've reskilled. I work in supply chain management.
You got...
Yes, I got out.
Reskilled lawyers in the room.
Yes. So I work in supply chain for Unilever. And I've been seconded to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, based in Geneva now, to help African countries to get their supply chain for life-saving medicine improved. And what I've learned in Unilever, people become very skilled at bypassing digitization. We've had fantastic investments in digitizing the whole planning process to get our products to our retailers on time, and people just bypassed using Excel, using the old ways of working. Even now, investing in African countries, we make investments in process improvements and digitizing those processes. And some investments which we think are high risk, they stick with people. And some investments which we think are really simple and very gradual, people resist. They don't take it, it's not living. How do you find the balance between pushing people, pushing the humans to accept the digitalization, or how to change the digitalization to the next generation so people actually accept it? That's the challenge which we find in the field.
I just think you have to make it work for them. If you build a product and you foist it on them, and it doesn't give them cycles back in their day, it doesn't improve the workflow, they're just not going to accept it. And so going back to the human-centered approach, that you have to start there. If you can't please them, they won't adopt it. And we see that all the time. We might put a feature in, and now with social media and other things that we've built into our products, we can get much quicker feedback. And we're like, oh, that didn't work. Pull that out, try another one. And so it's really about understanding what works best for the end user and not what we think works best for them.
And I have to say, a lot of it has to do, when we're talking human-centered experience, I mean, we should talk about fun for a moment. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the adoption of enterprise tools, there is a history of a lot of the most popular enterprise tools not being actually adopted by people until there was a fun element discovered. I mean, I remember when Slack first emerged, it actually started taking off by people putting animated GIFs in these rooms. They would still use these other more antiquated tools, but now, tools like Teams, Slack, and others, they first galvanize engagement through fun. I remember also, this trading floor technology back in the day in a previous career of mine that was instituted along a trading floor, and no one ever used it until one person found like sort of a fun, novel use case. Everyone sort of thought that was funny, and before you knew it, like 3 weeks later, everyone was using it. So a lot of the adoption of new technology comes down to the internal merchandising. And it's interesting how much we focus on the marketing of our products externally, and we'll hire these incredible agencies to come up with these amazing campaigns. But when it comes to rolling out an internal enterprise tool, it's like, send everyone an email, an online training session, and call it a day. And it's like, that never sold a product to a customer. Why would it sell it to an internal customer? And I think that's a big part of a successful rollout.
Yeah, I would say that we see this, UX was sort of an emerging discipline when we started, or an emerging title in 2010 when we started GA. And we've seen a steady growth that has really become explosive over the last few years. And interestingly, so much of the demand, it's really that in product management, is coming from really traditional, not even just B2B, but industrial companies who I think are starting to realize that you have to treat users as customers, regardless of whether or not they're giving you money, right? And so, and I think, Scott, this is really your whole thing. I mean, I feel like this is a big part of your career is understanding this process of how to get people to use your product, because there's a million products. Nobody has to use anything. And yes, they might work for you, but as you can see, if it works better to use Excel, they're going to use Excel. Like, that's what it's going to be. I almost said Google Docs because that's the problem in our company that we try to get rid of, but since Peggy's on the panel, I'll save Excel. But that is the truth. Everybody has choice. People have choice about where they're going to work. People have choice about how they're going to work. And you have to embrace that choice and you make it part of your process. And UX is really that core discipline. And so we see a ton of people who talk about upskilling, right? UX is one of those great, add it to your tool belt kind of skills. So we'll see everybody from software people to business people to project people taking that course, or at least a short version of that course, in order to be able to start thinking in that new way.
I think the other one is, were the people who are using it involved in the design of it in the first place? It's kind of the first piece to think about it. And then if they were, how do you create a community or a network between those people to talk about it? So they advocate for and solve the problems that are within it. And we used to put things out, we realized that you have to market internally just as hard as you market externally. And you put them out there, and there is a social thread called Reddit, if anybody's ever heard of that, which used to be my Sunday night reading. And I'd go through this, and somebody would say, can you believe XYZ's come out? Yada. And then somebody else would go, yeah, but have you tried this? And actually it works for this, or no, this piece is terrible. So taking the feedback from it and then changing it. And so we weren't trying to lead that dialogue to get engagement all the time. Actually, the people doing it were trying to lead the dialogue because they knew that it was better for them to do it. But sometimes you believe the person sitting next to you rather than the memo that's come down.
We've got time for one more question right here. Thank you.
Morning. I'm a lawyer. I'm kidding.
Wow.
No, I'm kidding. So I'm head of global business development for Hyperloop Transportation Technologies. And it's amazing that in the panel we were talking for about human-centered approach, not only for the end customer, but also the workforce. And the way that our founders, when they started a company, what they did a call to action to companies and contributors who wanted to work for us in exchange for stock options. So everyone becomes shareholder in the company. And the thing is that the way that we see how they're working with us, it's amazing because most of them are scientists or CFOs of companies that they work part-time for us or specifically in projects. So it would be interesting to understand in your company, how are you also thinking about this kind of relationship with this future of the workforce?
I think I'll start since I'm the sort of, I guess, HR-related company here, which is, I think we see that a lot, both in our own company, right? We have our instructor base. One of the things we learned very early at GA was that we thought we needed professors to give that sort of academic credibility, and professors would always crash and burn, and like get the worst scores, and everybody was bored and wouldn't come back. And so we really became a practitioner-led, classroom kind of company very early on. And of course, you want them to stay practitioners, so I don't want to hire them and keep them out of the workforce. So we keep a very large remote network of people who come and go as they please, and we actually have treated that as a benefit, not as a cost to the system, because that external experience they have, they come bring back, they get better, and they don't feel like they're falling behind by having to commit to one thing. I think we see that in the objectives of a lot of our students and graduates as well, is that they don't necessarily want a single job at any one time. Now some do, and I think it's a little bit, can sometimes be overblown how much the gig economy is going to take over and how fast that's going to happen. But I think it all comes down to flexibility. And I think, one of the memes I've seen a lot this year is just the side hustle. And I think that is it. Side hustle is sort of sometimes seen as, oh, wow, you're not making enough at your core job, so you have to go and do a side hustle. What I see is a lot of people, especially young people, wanting to have just multi-threaded experiences that allow them to bring more to everything that they do. And so I think to the extent that any organization can embrace that and encourage that, whether it's being on boards or committees or being involved in nonprofits, that stuff tends to have a really positive impact on the workforce. So that's how I think about it.
Great. Actually, we did have one more question. Right over here.
Thank you. As a professor at the Wharton School, who prides himself on crashing and burning, but also teaching reasonably well, also executive education. And
Jake, you've just been stepping in it all morning.
I could not but help react to Jake Schwartz. But
I'm going to note that I am a Wharton graduate, so it's great to meet you.
Great to meet you. No, but to take the fun out, I think what you're getting at, though, is that the type of learning that we do has changed. And I think it's about practice-oriented learning, but maybe even on-demand type of learning, right? Today, even in our MBA program, what we think about is, do you really need all that information in 2 years, and you might need some pieces 5 years from now? Why can't I have little modules that I can take? So in that spirit, I fully agree with the complementary approaches that we both get to partake in.
Absolutely. And I would say, look, a lot of GA was inspired by my business school experience, both the good parts and the bad parts. I think the good parts are where there were moments where I was learning how to do something that I could immediately see how I was going to use it 1,000,000 times. And it spurred a whole new insight into how work actually gets done. The bad parts were, I would say, most of those really exciting learning moments happened in the first half of the first semester, and then it became about looking for jobs and partying your face off, which is, you probably bemoan as much as I do. And I would say that, and look, educational institutions are going through a whole set of sort of reflections and their own transformation, because in some way, that degree was a little bit like a taxi medallion for a very long time, meaning that if you had the right to grant degrees, you really could sit back, raise your prices every year, and everything was great. And if you were Wharton, I mean, it's even better than that, right? You get invited to Davos and things like that. And I think what's happening now is that ostensible value proposition, which is we're going to sort of both give you a framework that lasts throughout your career, has to be translated into a more concrete value proposition of we are going to actually provide you value throughout your career. And our goal was to do that in the world of technology and data and these skills that, frankly, professors weren't that interested in teaching. And what we saw is just such an immediate demand where there was just no real alternative to that. And I think the other piece of that is just vocational training in general, and this is really in the US, I think there are places around the world that actually do this really well, started to become treated as a like it's for the people who couldn't go to normal school, right? And that is actually a product of a whole bunch of decisions about education policy that were made over the 20th century. It's not like a foregone conclusion that vocational training is less than, right? And so what we really wanted to do is build something that had the best of vocational school mixed with the best of graduate school, which, because I was the CEO, my graduate school experience was Wharton. So I definitely was trying to take and mix and match and build something that could really push that in the world of technology and design. Now, I did always fantasize about building some sort of punk rock B-school disruptor, but unfortunately it turns out that these guys have got a lock on it and I can't get in, so.
Great. Before we dismiss our panelists, I just want to throw it back to Anand, who's going to give us a little summary, and then we're going to head out into the brave world of Davos. Anand?
Thank you, Stephanie. And what a crazy, incredible panel, isn't it? I mean, firstly, look at the crowd. When we walked in this morning, 7:30, early dark. I wasn't expecting this to be a full house. This is actually beaming. It's like a rock shot here. And what an incredible panel of diverse opinions, depth, breadth. I don't think I can do justice in summarizing this, but let me throw a few things that were running through my mind as I was hearing each of you. So let's start with design and take HCL as an example. We are a 40-year-old engineering and technology services company. We're part of digital transformation journeys for our enterprise customers around the world. If I look at the last 7 years, the amount of design talent that has come into HCL is incredible, right? So we've hired UX designers, principals, ethnographers, design thinkers. And back to the point you were making, Stephanie, in the early years, that osmosis was very difficult. Getting designers and engineers to sit in the same room and work on a common purpose was stressful for me and a lot of the leaders that were dealing with that, because there was this rejection on both sides, as that you talked about. So we looked at a few things. One is we created zones of osmosis where they could come work together purposely on common outcomes. We also looked at resilience, teams who will not quickly eject each other, but teams who will start saying, let me see the other side of view, and actually I can create better outcomes together, get a different point of view that I did not have. Through that process, we actually also started thinking about this whole disciplinary collaboration, what that means. Because if you look at our teams today, we have designers, we have developers, we have data scientists, we have control systems folks doing IoT work. We have OCM folks on the same team. So there's a really, truly multidisciplinary team, and sometimes multicultural, because they're sitting across the world. So the one thing that we started looking at is not just measure expertise in terms of engineering talent or developer talent or data talent, but also looking at empathy in a little bit more measurable value. So we actually follow this principle called Dreyfus principle, where we look at empathy or situational awareness as equally as expertise levels of the teams. Now, one way to, this is easier to say, but how do you really, implement it practically? So one way we changed our hiring model is something you talked about. We used to hire through interviews. We actually shifted to hiring through hackathons. Now, when you hire through hackathons, you're automatically putting teams together, forcing them to collaborate, and you actually can see which of the teams are going to collaborate and which are not. And you actually start sort of getting these dimensions of situational awareness and collaborative natures right at the inception of the team. So that was one experiment that's kind of scaled now, where even our customers that interact with us and we build teams for customer execution programs, those teams are brought in through hackathons. So that's a great thing. I think the final thing is OCM, the whole organizational change and culture. Think about this, 130,000 employees around the world, 36 countries, a lot of engineers. So there's a lot of type A personalities who think they're at the cusp of technology, they understand everything. But we had to introduce this culture of learning and constant evolution. I think Satya talks about being a learning organization. Our CEO, CVK, talks about being sort of this learning, relearning, and unlearning organization. And so how do you create that sort of culture where you also make it inclusive? You don't make islands saying, this is the cool team, this is not the cool team. This is the next generation technology team, this is the old technology team. So really creating constant learning mechanisms where people can move over to the other side of the bridge and work together. I think this has been a huge evolution for us. And it's an ongoing thing. You talked about numbers. Obviously, the Walmart numbers just fades everything out in the room. But we've actually trained about 50,000 people in the last 4 years on everything from design, data, technology, agile processes, working iteratively, OCM, and it's an ongoing process. So that's the final thing I would say, that this is the culture change and the human-centered approach we're talking about is the shift we are making. It's not a one-time program. It's not something we do for 1 year and the enterprise calls it a success. I think it's the shift in how enterprises like us operated, and that's the summary for this session. So thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you, the panelists, for making this an incredibly amazing morning. Lots of learning, lots of things to assimilate for us, and thank you for showing up in big numbers this morning.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Scott, Peggy, Judith, and Jake. Thank you.